afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final episode in the summer series of FIXinars running throughout the summer up until the EMEA Trading Conference, which this year is going virtual and going global. We're delighted to introduce one of the FIX trading community's co-chairs, Hanno Klein of the Global Technical Committee. Today's episode will be covering FIX latest and how you can benefit from it. Should you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or add to the Q&A function below. Please note Chatham House rules apply. Any other members of media, please make yourself known to the FIX Programme Office. I'll hand over to Hanno Klein. Thank you.
Hello and welcome everybody. So let's get started. My name is Hanno Klein. I'm co-chair for the EMEA region for the Global Technical Committee. Today I wanted to talk about FIX latest, what it is, what it's about, how it came about. So with that, here's my agenda for today, the history, then how the FIX versions are being used today, actually, the current practices, then what is FIX latest actually include, and last not least, to go through the rich business functionality offered by FIX in 2020, obviously grown quite a bit over the years through the various extensions. So what you see here is the so-called technical stack of FIX, showing the FIX family of standards. And as you can see, FIX latest is about the application layer on top. Before we continue, I would like to ask for the first poll, thank you. How many different message types do you think FIX latest supports? Anything between less than 50 and more than 200? Take your vote. That's the first poll where I'd like to get some feedback from those on the call. Oh, first one now. That looks pretty much on target. Some are below 100 and some are more optimistic or more positive, more than 200. Okay. Then the second poll is about the fields. How many different fields do you think FIX latest currently has? Give you a few more seconds to cast your vote. Let's see, we got some results here between 2,000 and 5,000, 510,000. That's pretty accurate. So let's move to the history of FIX versions. So here you see sort of the answer to the questions, all the way on the right-hand side. You can see that FIX latest with extension back 258 currently has 164 messages and almost 6,000 fields. And note that more than 3,000 of those fields are actually for OTC derivative instruments and in the tag range above 40,000. For those of you wondering how 6,000 fields fit into the well-known range of 1 to 5,000. So a FIX version is always a static set of messages and components, fields, values for the application layer. And starting with FIX 4.4 in 2003, we used extension packs to incrementally enhance the functional scope of FIX and giving them a number. And the higher number automatically includes all the functionality available from the lower numbers. But we didn't start publishing them separately until FIX 5.0 Service Pack 2 in April 2009, which is obviously also now more than 10 years ago. So EP98 was the first extension pack separately published. All others were then previously rolled into the next version or service pack, because as of FIX 5, we also issued service packs instead of versions. We call them sort of the same as Microsoft with their Windows service packs. And now that's sort of the history. And we were then always faced with the term FIX 5.0 Service Pack 2 with extension packs, and just wanted to have a single term that would always identify the highest version of FIX. And that's where FIX latest came from. Something that my co-chair, Jim Nordy, actually introduced as an idea, and we stuck with it. So the extension packs, which continuously add to FIX latest, they will not break backward compatibility, but we may deprecate elements that have been replaced to overcome some limitations. For example, we have a field that's maybe a Boolean data type, and now suddenly we need the third value instead of just yes or no, 0 or 1. And instead of changing the data type of an existing field, which would break backward compatibility, we may introduce a new one, which is an integer data type, and deprecate the previous one, which means you can still use it, but we recommend going for the new field. The term FIX legacy is used for all Fix versions up to Fix 5 Service Pack 2, and including it as well. And we have labeled the 3 most common versions still used as supported. That's Fix 4.2, 4.4, and 5.0 Service Pack 2. And the others are then automatically labeled unsupported versions. In FIXimate, if you go there, it will display Fix Latest, but you're also able then to go to the Fix Legacy versions, which we'll see in a later slide. So back to the numbers, you can see starting out in January 1996 with Fix 4 having less than 30 messages and 140 fields, and also Fix 4.2, which is still very much in use, has less than 50 messages and less than 500 fields. We're now all the way up to, as I said, 164 messages and almost 6,000 fields. So how are these versions used today? So an interface specification is also called a rules of engagement document to define what actually is allowed to be exchanged between two counterparties, the messages, fields, values, and so on. So the counterparties always agree on a given subset. And the version actually plays a minor role on the application layer as of Fix 4.4, because as of Fix 4.4, there were no more semantic changes that would break backward compatibility like before. So the Fix session layer is actually the issue for people migrating from Fix 4 versions to Fix 5.0. It's not an issue for other encodings like FIXML or simple binary encoding, which use different session layers. And the Fix session protocol, maybe you've seen the announcement and maybe you looked into it, has been refactored. So it's the same capabilities. It's just put into a different format, and a term has been introduced called a session profile, which then basically reflects the different versions on the session layer. Fix 4.2, Fix 4.4, Fix T being the Fix 5 session layer name, all of these values that must be in the field begin string to make a session work. And obviously the session needs to be the same between two counterparties. They run a certain session, but on the application layer, there's much more freedom to decide the actual subset being supported. So we recognize that Fix 4.2 is still extensively used, specifically in the equities space. There is some change of semantics, or has been, to Fix 4.3. So fields like exec trans type, a key field, was deprecated, and exec type values 1 and 2, partial fill and fill, were replaced by value F being trade, so that the order status was partially filled or filled. So these semantic changes obviously can cause an issue for people to migrate away of Fix 4.2. 4.2 had repeating groups as a concept for contra brokers, allocations, other things, but most users haven't built any software to support that kind of message structure, so just can only support individual fields. So the GTC governance board a few years ago already recommended that the users of any version can use fields and values from later versions of Fix if these meet their business requirements, and that they retrofit them into their implementation as much as they can. So a Fix 4.4 user has most likely implemented repeating groups and is sort of completely free there. For Fix 4.2, the regulatory requirements that caused a number of extensions in Fix were an issue, so that the GTC has reserved a range of the user-defined fields in the 8,000 to 8,499 range to then define sort of workarounds for simple cases of repeating groups needed for regulatory requirements of regulatory reporting. One example being the order attribute group containing one or more order attributes. So a single field, 8015, was introduced that has basically a space-delimited string with space-delimited values, so that it emulates a simple repeating group. And you can see that on the next slide. That's a screenshot of the user-defined fields as available on the Fix website, order attribute types, as you can see, and it makes a reference to the standard fields that it emulates for those Fix 4.2 users that cannot support repeating groups. Moving on to scope, meaning what is FIXlatest made up of? So the scope goes beyond just the core application layer as we define it. So we want to see FIXlatest also express documents, tools, related standards, all the ingredients that you need for your interface to implement it, to test it, to exchange with your counterparties the information that's needed. So obviously there's the messages and there's the components and repeating groups, all the fields in the different ranges, so standard fields in the range tag number 1 to tag number 5,000 and then tag number 40,000 and above, as well as the specific user-defined range 8,000 to 8,499 for coverage of regulatory requirements for fixed legacy versions. Then there's the normative specification and normative guidelines, where you have things like required versus optional fields. There's conditional requirements you find in the text. There's workflows, which messages go back and forth. Then there's scenarios. So how does an execution report look like if the order was just added but not executed? And so there's various flavors of that execution report depending on what happens. That's something we call scenarios. And then there's the non-normative guidelines, or better known as recommended practices. So for a specific asset class or usage group, how should you use Fix for this specific environment? FIXlatest obviously includes actual artifacts, documents, the normative Fix specification, which is now online since a couple of months now, and we'll see a few screenshots in a minute. And there's also a web page for all the recommended practice documents and spreadsheets. And then there's an increasingly large set of tools. And you're probably well aware and familiar with FIXimate, FIXwiki. FIXorchestra tools is something fairly new, and there's a separate FIXinar on FIXorchestra and its tools, but also collaboration tools for the working groups inside Fix. So there's sort of 3 different ones: the Fix discussion forum, which is for the entire community, all Fix users. You don't have to be a member to participate, to ask questions there. Then there's iMeet Central for collaboration of Fix working groups, specifically those that want to extend the application layer and submit gap analysis proposals. And then there's also GitHub, again, for everybody developing a Fix application. So let's have a look a little bit on what's there online. The FIXlatest, if you haven't seen it yet, is right the first entry under standards. And what you see in the red circle is sort of how current it is. And we're now all the way up to EP 258, which is the latest extension pack that was approved. There are a few that are in public review, there's always a few in the pipeline. And this will update as we then update the FIXlatest specification, which will be as incremental as we update also FIXimate. So here you can see the different areas of the FIXlatest online specification, the introduction, describing the data types, user-defined field concept, and the global components, which are components that are used across more than one area: pre-trade, trade, and post-trade. And this is also the bulk of it. What you see here, 3 main areas: pre-trade, trade, and post-trade, where there's always specification, an online specification there, and second button saying messages and components gets you right to the layouts of the individual messages and components of that area. The infrastructure area at the bottom has additional elements related to the user management, network status, application sequencing, things that are not really associated with a pre-trade, trade, or post-trade area there. And this website also has some links to download the documents for those that prefer to get a PDF version of the online specification. Here's a screenshot of FIXimate, or actually I put a few screenshots together. On the right-hand side, you can see the actual FIXimate screen. I just wanted to point out that you can sort of flip back and forth between FIXlatest and the FIXlegacy version. So on the left-hand side is the starting point, where you then have in the menu an entry saying FIXimate for legacy versions. If you click on that, you will get a very similar looking screen but the entry will change to FIXinar for latest EP so that you can switch back and forth. And if you go to the legacy versions, you actually have a drop-down list, which you can see in the bottom right, where you can choose from a number of Fix versions. Currently, we're still showing all of them supported as well as unsupported ones. That may change in the future, but you will always have access to the documents also of the unsupported versions there. Here now we have a screenshot of the Fix discussion forum. And before I continue, I would like to ask for the third poll. Thank you. How are you using the Fix discussion forum? Very simple categories here, just to get a feel for the relevance of that, at least for the group that's joined today. Okay, that's a fairly high number that's not using the discussion forum at all. So thank you very much for that feedback. I think it's a very valuable tool. It works for the Global Technical Committee also as a means of communication. So what you see here in the red circles are discussion threads or postings from the Fix program office. So we use it to publicly review gap analysis proposals that have been preliminarily approved by the Global Technical Committee and are now then available for comment of the entire fixed trading community for 2 weeks at least. Some the bigger ones, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, that depends. Or also if we want to post a technical standard, a final standard such as Fix Orchestra, you see here the draft standard being posted for information so that you can find links to the actual documents. But the majority of entries you see is always from Fix users that have a question or comment and would like to get thoughts from others in the community. So I think it's a very important tool for the entire community, and you don't have to be a member to participate in this. Moving on to another part of the scope of Fix latest are related standards. There's Fix Orchestra, there's not just the tools, but there's also the technical standard for metadata on how to describe an interface. And it actually supports Fix as well as non-Fix interfaces. And then there's FIXMMT, market model topology, Fix standard for post-trade flagging that was created in the context also of regulatory reporting under MiFID. And there's Fix ATDL, the algorithmic trading definition language, used to drive graphical user interfaces for strategies. And things that you're probably very familiar with, but may not be as obvious, that there are, I think, close to 20 different ISO standards that Fix is actually using and sharing sort of in the valid values or in the data type. So for things like the marketplaces or legal entities, currencies, all of these things. So these related standards, as you can see here, Fix ATDL and Fix MMT are on the application layer, providing very specific use cases here. And Orchestra basically goes over the entire stack, where you can define not just the messages, but also workflows and scenarios. Orchestra includes the repository of messages, fields, and values, as well as an interface definition. So anything you need to describe an interface on the different layers. With that, I'll move on to the area of business functionality covered by Fix, because I think many people aren't aware of the breadth of functionality that is covered by now, not just because of regulatory requirements leading to enhancements of Fix, but also marketplaces, big exchanges that have added quite a bit of functionality over the last years. So first and foremost, obviously, how to identify products and instruments and asset classes. There's something you are probably familiar with, the product and the security type tags, but maybe not with asset class, asset subclass, asset type. This is a support for a risk taxonomy as opposed to the pre-existing product taxonomy, and the asset group field to indicate the broad product or asset classification. So it offers two different ways of looking at your hierarchy here. There's obviously the single component instrument, very extensive. All the OTC derivatives fields, which are thousands, are all inside that instrument component that covers all asset classes. So there's not one per asset class in the Fix concept. And as you can see, over the years, we've basically covered all asset classes, even though FIX started in the equities world. Additional components are then for the legs of an instrument and the underlyings of an instrument, again containing similar things and the main instrument component. And then there's also generic components and fields to define complex relationships between instruments, instrument legs, and underlyings within a single message. Also fairly new there, the related instrument group, and it's definitely worth taking a look here if you have quite complex baskets or relationships between your instruments, mostly in the OTC world, and you want to express that with FIX. And as you can see on the right-hand side again, it's supposed to indicate that it goes across all three areas: pre-trade, trade, and post-trade. So the pre-trade area, I will just briefly go over some of the things here that you may not be aware of. Others are there since 20, 25 years. You are well aware of probably. So in the indication area, the IOIs should be well known. Cross request, maybe less, the way you can announce the intention of submitting orders that may result in a cross trade. And self-match prevention is a topic for regulators. So there's some functionality in there to fulfill regulatory requirements. In the quoting area, that's fairly well known, I would say. Also a lot of recommended practices in that area, be it single quotes, mass quotes, RFQs. On the market data side, I would like to point out the market data statistics. That's something that's probably less well known, where the existing messages sort of were intended for real-time market data, but historic market data, aggregated market data, that was a gap that was filled now a few years ago, and we've extended it again for MiFID. I think RTS 28, RTS 29 were the documents there, so that you can provide basically any statistical value about your trading behavior, but including things like system failures, any statistical information about what's happening in the trading system. Moving on with the pre-trade area, there's large groups of messages for reference data. And the securities reference data is probably well known for lists of securities, derivatives, equities, all kinds of asset classes. The market structure reference data is probably not as well known, where you can define the complete set of trading rules and market data feeds that are available, the trading sessions and their schedules, and the specific rules tied to specific sessions. So very rich functionality here. Parties reference data is another area that's not as well known, where you can not just define parties in much more detail than just for the basic parties component, but also provide a complete set of entitlement information and risk limit information to describe how your participants, for example, of an exchange, can interact with the exchange and what their risk limits are. Party action messages, for example, to suspend, halt, or reinstate a trading party, also something within that area. Moving on to trade, I won't say much about that because that is well established, and you have single order handling, mass order handling. Mass order is a message that is not as old yet, similar to mass quotes, but with the entire state model for orders included there. So have a look at that. And the program trading hasn't changed very much over the last 10 years, I would say, all well known. Post-trade, also a lot of stuff in there since many years, allocations, trade reporting, trade entry. The trade match report is maybe something rather new. It's quite specific to transport complete events of complex instruments matching between trading and clearing systems as an atomic event. Position maintenance also has been around for a long time now. Moving on to margin requirements, which is fairly new. Collateral management, settlement, things that have been around for a while. Pay management is very new. It's not for payment instructions to the payment banks. It's between the investment managers and their brokers to define what are the expected instructions, payment instructions to follow there. That's an area that has only been covered last year, I think. And there's account summary reporting from the clearinghouse to its members, something driven by the OCC, for example, and other small things. So with that, there's one more area, the infrastructure area, where I would just like to point out application sequencing, which can be used for application level recovery. So if you don't want to use session level recovery, and for those of you interested in the new refactored session layer, there is something called FIXT, lightweight FIXT, and came in from the Chinese. It's one of the session profiles, and that actually explicitly omits session level recovery, so that the FIX engines do not have to recover all messages at that level, and the recovery is left to the application layer. And that's where application sequencing comes in and can be used to selectively recover things, so that mass quotes, for example, may not be recoverable, but any trades resulting from these quotes are then in an application stream that can be recovered. So with that, I'm actually at the end of my presentation, and I already saw, I think, one question being posted, so I'm hoping for some questions that I can answer now.
Thanks, Hanno. There is just one question that I can see at the moment in the Q&A field. Again, if anybody's got any more to add, please add them. So the first question that I've seen is FIXlatest just the term to speak about the newest version?
Well, it's not just the newest version, it's a difference in concept, I think, because we've realized that the discussion of which version are you on is sort of less related to the application layer. It's more all about the session layer, the begin string value. Yeah, that obviously has to be the same, that has to work together. But FIXlatest as a concept means it's, if you will, it's a sort of a moving target, because the new extension packs will feed into the same animal. It will still be called the FIXlatest when we add extension pack 259 to it. Yeah? Right now it has 258 extension packs. So it is to sort of have sort of a conceptual shift that the rules of engagement, hopefully supported by Fix Orchestra, defining the metadata, is just about agreeing on a subset of the application layer messages and fields being supported, and not sort of agreeing on a version. Obviously, if you use in different encoding, like simple binary encoding or Google protocol buffers, you have to agree on a version of this technical standard. And on the fixed session layer, you also have to know, is it FIXT, is it the FIX4 session layer, is it LFIXT? So that's where we think the term version still plays a role, but not on the application layer. That's why we introduced FIXlatest, to move away from that.
We've got a few more coming in here.
I'll just go top to bottom. Do I have to make changes to my existing Fix implementation to support FIXlatest? So I basically already said it. No, you don't have to make any changes. It's about the session layer. If that does not change, then you can immediately support FIXlatest by just using all the tags that are there. So there may be limitations in terms of Fix 4.2. And I'm seeing that as the next question. Can I use FIXlatest if my counterparty is still using an older version, for example, Fix 4.2? The topic of repeating groups I spoke about. Yeah? So if your counterparty does not support a repeating group, it's obviously hard to then use repeating groups from later Fix versions. But you can always use Fix tags for regulatory requirements that have been defined as part of FIXlatest. You can use that for your Fix 4.2 counterparty. So the answer to that second question, yes, you can use FIXlatest with your counterparty having Fix 4.2. Last question I see here on the screen, can Hanno say more about how recovery at the application layer works? The chosen session layer cannot be relied on to perform that function. So the idea is that today's connections, TCP/IP connections, are very reliable. And the burden on the Fix engines to keep track of each and every Fix message without knowing the business value of this message, that there must be an answer to this. And actually from the Chinese, they sort of provided that answer, saying, okay, we want something, and they called it lightweight FIXT, and this is now part of the refactored Fix session layer, where the assumption is, okay, on that TCP/IP layer, we're assuming everything works fine. On the application layer is where the problems come, so that the application layer can then decide what are the messages that are relevant from a business point of view, and they need to be recoverable. Whereas others, like the mass quotes or market data messages, really don't have to be recoverable. So say more about how that works. Well, it works in a way that you define streams. So application ID, Apple ID is a tag, for example, where you can define any name. For example, you could say trade, yeah, and then on these execution reports, you would carry that application ID tag with the name of that stream, and then there are a few specific messages for application sequencing to find out, do I have a gap to re-request a retransmission from sequence number X to sequence number Y, and to find out, have all, for example, trades on that stream been delivered now? What was the last application sequence number? So what you have on the session layer with message sequence numbers, which cannot have any gaps and everything needs to be recovered, you have on the application layer where gaps can be intentional, and it can be divided into logical streams by means of the application ID tag to then provide drop copy feeds, for example, of trades, or order book replay, or whatever you want to make recoverable, provide that in separate streams. I hope that answered the question sufficiently.
I'd like to say thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Hanno, very interesting presentation and questions. All of these FIXinars will be available on demand at the EMEA Trading Conference. If you haven't yet registered your pass, please go to the event website to do so. Other events are also on our website. There's plenty on there, additional webinars and other events. I will also be sending out within the thank you some links to Fix Latest and some of the other items that Hanno has mentioned in his presentation today. I'd also like to mention that at the EMEA Trading Conference, Hanno, as well as some of our other experts, will be available in the Fix Lab. So something else to look out for at the conference. Thank you once again for joining today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.